All right, we're in Habakkuk. We're going to finish Habakkuk today. It's amazing. 7 weeks, 2 books. Fastest pace you've ever seen. Next week, we'll start in Micah, if you guys didn't know that. So we'll be making our way. There's actually 12 minor prophets. We're not going to do all 12, but I was talking about it with Angel this week, saying, hey, this will be kind of a good rest to take 3 minor prophets at a time as we move throughout the different seasons of teaching. But it's been good. I've really enjoyed Nahum and very much enjoyed Habakkuk. The title this morning is The Action of Waiting. Last week we talked about will we stand? As I stand, I will wait. To stand in the waiting. And this morning we're going to talk about that there's actually an action to waiting, and we will know and grow and understand what that is all about this morning. We are in chapter 3, and I'm going to go ahead and read the whole chapter. Habakkuk chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear? In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging water swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses and the surging of mighty waters. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. We're going to take a bird's eye view of Habakkuk chapter 3 initially, and then we'll move into the details of the verses as we go. So as we do that, you'll see lots of what seems to be repetitive kind of themes to say, hey, this is what it's about and this is where we're moving. So hopefully you can follow along and it'll make sense as we wrap up the prophet Habakkuk. Verse 1. Verse 1 is an introduction to chapter 3. It is a title. It is an address. It is a label that is given for those that will be participating in the reading, ultimately in the singing of chapter 3, because chapter 3 is a psalm. It is a prayer. It is a prayer from Habakkuk the prophet, and it is a prayer or a psalm that is set to music. It is meant to be a worship song. The word Shigionoth, which is a really, really funny word, just add that to your daily vocabulary. At the end of the day, we don't know what it means, which means it's very similar to Selah. You've heard throughout the Psalms, and even in this psalm, you see the word Selah. There's a lot of theories about what that means. Is it a pause? Is it to pause and take in the depth of Scripture? Is it a musical direction? And so, like Selah, Shigionoth is most likely a musical instruction. It's musical instruction to the psalm that says, hey, when we play this, when we sing this, when we are setting the mood and the tone and the occasion for the psalm, that's what this word means. So when you move into a time of worship, into a time of singing Habakkuk 3, Shigionoth sets the mood. And so if you need to set the mood this evening as you're eating dinner, just Shigionoth it. Not sure if that's how you say it, whatever. Chapter 3 often stood alone. It stood alone and it was circulated separately, which is why Habakkuk's name is mentioned again. So you have 1 and 2 that gives the occasion of the chapter 3 psalm. We know all the details, we know the histories, but often in the worship time of God's people, Habakkuk 3 circulated on its own as its own hymn, its own psalm. And so that's why the first verse kind of gives again the occasion. Hey, just a reminder, this is a prayer. This is a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet. This is why we're singing this. This is a memory of who God is. So again, all of that is part of knowing and understanding chapter 3. Verse 2 is a petition. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear? In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. What does Habakkuk ask of God? Let your work be done. Renew your work of salvation among your people. That is the request. That is what Habakkuk is asking of God, and he gives detail in this request. God, as you renew your work of salvation, preserve life. In the midst of the years, revive it, preserve life. In the midst of the years, make it known, provide understanding. O Lord, renew your salvation among your people, and as you do that, preserve life. As you do that, provide understanding for your people. May we understand your work. May we understand your salvation. And finally, Lord, in your wrath, remember mercy. That is what Habakkuk is asking. Preserve life. Make it known. Let us understand. And, O Lord, remember mercy. We then see in verses 3 through 7 is actually a description of what is called a theophany. I'll get to that in a second, but you can just put that in your notes. There'll be more to add to that later. And then verses 8 through 15 are a description, a poetic, a musical description, a good depiction of how do we describe a battle between Yahweh and two different things, the battle between Yahweh and nature, or the battle between Yahweh and his enemies, and it's all described through beautiful language. In fact, verses 3 through 15, so it's not just the theophany, but the description of the battle between God and nature and or his enemies, are the most extensive and elaborate theophany in the Old Testament. So some of you may be asking, what's a theophany? It's an appearance of God in great power and glory. So some examples of this, obviously, God showing up in the burning bush with Moses is a theophany. Some other events of the Exodus are a theophany. The giving of the law on Mount Sinai is a theophany. Exodus chapter 19, verse 9, verse 16, verses 18 through 19, all give descriptions of these occasions. And the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder." Again, a description of the presence of God specifically and directly among his people. So verses 3 through 15 are this theophany explained. We then move to verses 16 through 19. As we dive into those verses, again, I'm giving you an outline before we go through specifics. It's basically Habakkuk's response in faith to how God has revealed himself. And as we look at verses 16 through 19 in Habakkuk's response of faith, we are looking to say, what is the answer to Habakkuk's question? Remember, chapters 1 and chapter 2 was all about Habakkuk asking God question. Reminder, in case you need a reminder, what did Habakkuk ask? Why does God allow the wicked to go unpunished? Is the ultimate question that is asked. And in verses 16 through 19, we get yet another robust answer to that question. And the answer is, he doesn't allow the wicked to go unpunished. That is the answer that is given. God's purpose for the earth will come to completion. And this is what will take place concerning the wicked. Chapter 3 tells us again what is going to take place concerning the wicked, answering Habakkuk's initial question. Okay, that's the first outline I'll give you. Now I'm going to give you another one. So just follow along as we move through chapter 3. If God is in fact sovereign and in control, then chapter 3 explains this sovereignty, explains that God is at work, explains that God is in control. Verse 2, God has acted in the past to overcome his enemies, and he will do it again. Again, read verse 2. "O Lord, I have heard the report of you. You have been at work among your people. I know this to be true. And your work that I have heard about, O Lord, do I fear in the midst of the years." And then there's that petition that we talked about. Verse 2 is saying, "Oh God, I know you act for the benefit of your people. I have seen it happen throughout history, and so now I am going to be confident in the fact that you listen even to me, the prophet, and listen to the plight of your people now." So verse 2 moves us. Then verse 3, God is coming as he did before. And we're given two specific areas. I could have spent a lot of time putting a map on the screen and showing you the different areas. I decided not to do that, even though I get excited about it. But verse 3 is God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Basically, both of those areas are from the south of Judah. And basically it's saying, hey, God is coming as he did before, from the south, moving his people into the promised land, making a nation of the Hebrews. We've seen God intimately involved in the lives and the purposes and the direction and the health and the benefit of his people. And so we believe that he will do it again. Verse 4. His power is described as that of a warrior with lightning and thunder, the presence of God. I want you to take in again the imagery. Verse 5, God alone will prevail. If you read verse 4, his brightness was like the light, like lightning, rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power, this thunder. Verse 5, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. Now, we don't really understand pestilence and plague very much. We kind of get an idea of it, but we live in a even though COVID maybe has rattled our cages, we live in somewhat of a sanitized environment. Things for the most part are clean. But in the ancient world and in the ancient experience, definitely and certainly during the invasion of other people, verse 5 is saying that God alone is going to prevail. And even though there are battles that are taking place, that peoples are conquering other peoples, that the battlefield is overridden with corpses, that's where it gets unsanitized. You have to put yourself in the ancient experience of cities knowing what the battlefield looks like. Like, we don't have an idea of that, really. I mean, those of us who haven't experienced the battlefield firsthand, which there are some of us who have, but for those who haven't, your experience may be from watching Saving Private Ryan or another movie like that, Dunkirk or whatever. And even in that, you start to get an image of what that looks like. But to be in a city that just outside the city wall is a battlefield that is ridden with death. And what accompanies death? Pestilence and plague. See, this is very vivid imagery of destruction. The rotting of human flesh causes disease, and that's what's being described here. So it is not a sanitary description. It's saying that God has been moving, and yes, Assyria has fallen, and yes, Judah for the meantime has been protected, but there's wickedness in Judah, and Babylon is going to be the nation that disciplines Judah, but eventually Babylon will go away as well. So there's very real experiences post-battle, and they're described as pestilence and plague, verse 6. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. God is sovereign over the universe and over each nation. In fact, what is being declared about God is he can deal with the sin of Judah, and at the same time, he can deal with the arrogance of Babylon. It's not one or the other. God, in his sovereign control and his ability to understand all human activity, can work in the middle of the wicked, in the middle of the righteous, in the middle of those who are close to him, in the middle of those who are far away from him. God is again at work, is what verse 6 is saying. Verse 8. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Again, his wrath is poured out over the waters. In ancient times, water was a scary place. It was the unknown. It's why it's called the deep. Monsters lived in the water. There was this connection to, we don't understand the water, and therefore it is a scary, scary, scary place. So when you see it happen in Scripture, you notice this darkness that's described as water, and God is opposing the darkness of the deep. Again, another way to say it is God is against the wicked. It's just said in a poetic, musical type of form. Verse 11, the sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. Remember, Habakkuk is what? Remembering the activities of God in the past. And so verse 11, for all of you Bible scholars out there, should put something in your brain that says, wait, this sounds familiar. There's something here. The long day of Joshua. Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. At that time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon, in the valley of Ajalon, and the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. Again, verse 11 is describing God's activities in the past, that it was as if the day stood still. God, verse 12, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. What is this describing? Again, in beautiful, musical, poetic form, God is on the move. God does not sit in Asgard like Loki. Hopefully you guys are up to speed with what's going on, and totally fleece his people and just expect everybody to serve him. Right? I think that's pretty good on-the-fly illustration, if I do say so myself. Just got Loki on the brain. God is a God that is actively engaged for the benefit of his people. Verse 13, more description. You went out. Why is God active? Verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people. For the salvation of your anointed, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Oh man, the overtones, the imagery, the biblical narrative that's just rattling, that's echoing, that should start your pulse racing about what is God doing? God is on the move, verse 12. Verse 13, God is working for the salvation of his people. And then we're reminded, what is God doing? Well, Habakkuk has already referenced, you have worked in the past through Moses. He's talked about you've been moving from up the south to give the people the promised land. You moved through the amazing prophet Moses. You're working in the present among your people. We don't quite understand it. You worked for the benefit of your people by destroying Assyria, and now here we are, and there's angst inside of me because I don't quite understand, God, what you're doing, but I believe that you're working in the presence among your people, and we're waiting for you to establish what you have promised to establish, that you are going to bring a king that will establish after David. All of this is connected. This should sound familiar from 1 and 2 Samuel. You will work in the future by giving us who? The Messiah. You have Moses in the past. You have the present. God is doing something among his people. He's moving the work of salvation into the future, and we know who the Messiah is. It's Jesus. Even in this space, notice this should sound familiar. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked. Where else is it talked about that a head will be crushed? Genesis. There's something beautiful about the connection of Scripture. God is on the move. Why? For the salvation of his people. The same God who has acted through history will continue to act. God will lead his people even when the circumstances of our days seem the worst yet. Write that down. Habakkuk is experiencing what he believes to be the worst yet. And in the middle of his despair, in the middle of his pain, in the middle of his questions, he laments and he seeks answers from God himself. Even when circumstances seem the worst they could have ever been, God is leading his people. God crosses time and space to enter into the sinful messiness of human existence. A lot of Habakkuk, even a lot of Nahum, has been you asking the question of yourself. Do you trust the character of God? Do you trust the goodness of God? Do you trust the sovereignty of God? Do you trust that God cares more for you than you care for yourself? Do you trust that God is accomplishing his purposes? All of that is part of what these prophets are trying to get us to understand. God is crossing time and space to enter into the sinful messiness. Ultimately, that takes place through his son, Christ, of human existence to save those who are most victimized by the world's brokenness. That is who God is, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. As you read Habakkuk, as you take it in, as you sing this celebration, this psalm, this is the God that we worship. Verse 2, God is powerful. Verse 4, God is splendor. Verse 3, God is glory. Verse 8, God is a God that does display his wrath. Verse 13, God is merciful. Verse 19, God is full of grace. There's another mini outline. I told you there's going to be a lot. This is who God is. And in the middle of who God is, here's the first 2 questions of the morning, although I'm sure I've asked already 15. How do you embrace and live these truths of God? How do you embrace and live the power of God, the glory of God, the splendor of God, the wrath of God, the mercy of God, the grace of God? How do you embrace and live these truths of God? And then, as you do that, that's the embracing and the living, is God asking you to be part of his intervention. Go back to that previous statement. God crosses time and space to enter into the sinful messiness of human existence. Why? To save those who are most victimized by the world's brokenness. Is it actually possible that God is asking the church, which means God is asking you to participate in alleviating the brokenness of the sinfulness of humanity? The answer is yes. That's why we're here. To be salt and light and different and redeemed. What does it mean to embrace and to live these truths of God? You see, all of this reminds us as we move through what Habakkuk is moving, it reminds us once again of the hinge of Habakkuk. The hinge of Habakkuk was verse 4 of chapter 2. What did we learn? Righteousness is the result of faith. Righteousness is the result of faithfulness. We know that faith works because the power of God intervenes. If you grow in faith, you grow in an understanding of God's intervention. That's what faith is. So if the hinge is verse 4, you'll grow in righteousness because faith is at work in you. And faith works because the power of God is intervening. And the justified, those who have been saved by grace through faith, will live by the steadfast love of God. It's the fuel. Currently, the light is on in my car that says you need gas. Is your light on that says you need gas? You need to be fueled by the steadfast love of God. Are you the constant procrastinator that goes to the gas station at the very last moment? Or are you the one that you could say, yeah, I could get in the car and here we go? Like, what does it mean to understand this type of faith? Faith works because the power of God intervenes. And those who are justified will live by the steadfast love of God. So if you're asking those first 2 questions, how do you embrace and live these truths of God? Is God asking you to be part of his intervention? Then here's the next set of questions. What is the condition of your faith? What is the condition of your faithfulness? Are you sick and anemic and tired all the time? Metaphorically speaking. Is that the condition of your faith? You just can't get off the couch when it comes to what it means to love Jesus. Or are you ready to get out of bed, to declare I'm not ashamed of the gospel, to put one foot in front of the other, even if you have a limp, and to say, God, you are worth it. I've seen your activities in the past. I know you're working in my present. And man, you have already given me the confidence of Jesus and his resurrection. And so I live for your glory. What is the condition of your faith? And what adjustments need to be made? What's going to move you from being a couch potato to a steadfast disciple of Christ? What are the adjustments? You know, I can't remember the last time I went to the doctor. Like, it was a long time. But recently, because I'm getting up there, you know, I'm going to be 48 this year. By the way, Angel's already 48, just so you know. And so 50's, you know, creeping around. And so it's about time for me to establish my primary care physician, PCP, by the way. So Angel went to the doctor. She did all the tests. I won't get into that. And she's like, Chad, you really need to make a doctor's appointment. Okay, I'll do it. Okay. And I did. Hey, good job. And I went to the doctor, and I actually liked her. She's a good human being. And I didn't feel like a cow when I was in the office. She actually talked to me. That was really nice. Spent more than 2 minutes. She didn't even have an iPad. It was great. Sorry, all the doctors in the room. So she did blood work and she did all that stuff. But here's the thing. When you go to the doctor, you got to make adjustments. You just do. So you get the blood work and you're like, doing okay. Yeah. Oh. I'm pretty healthy for the most part. But what does it look like to say, no, I stand before you, Jesus, and Holy Spirit, make whatever adjustments need to be made. Take all the blood you need. Do all the lab work you need. And I won't ignore it. I'll make the adjustments. I'll do what's necessary. I'll get healthy before a righteous, good, steadfast, loving Father. Because faithfulness is what moves us into righteousness. And it requires courage. Do you see the seriousness and the necessity of these adjustments? If someone refuses to go to the doctor and they never know the condition of their blood and their cholesterol is through the roof, they will die of a heart attack. I mean, I'm making very general assumptions here, but you get what I'm saying. If you never stand before a holy God and say, let's make some adjustments, then you are just going to live in dysfunction and unhealth spiritually. What does it mean to be a child who looks to the seriousness and the necessity of these adjustments? And then finally, who's helping you be courageous? Who's walking alongside? Who do you trust? Who are you open with? Who are you honest with? Who do you get encouragement from? Are you trapped in secrecy, or are you open? Are you saying, make the adjustments, make the adjustments? Oh, dear God, make the adjustments. Verse 16. It's the transition. It's the connection to the hinge. Verse 4 is the hinge of all of Habakkuk, but verse 16, in this psalm, in this song, in this praise, it is the transition. Habakkuk is saying, oh God, I have heard your answer. I hear. I've heard you respond, God, and my body trembles. It trembles because I'm in your presence, and my lips are quivering at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. There's this understanding of who I am standing before a holy and righteous God. My legs tremble beneath me. Verse 16, I've heard your answer. I have encountered the Most High God. My body is trembling. And the only response to an encounter with the holy and righteous God is, I can only respond in reverence and unworthiness. You see that throughout all of Scripture. God shows up, everyone falls on their face. Are we in that posture before God? My knees are trembling. And notice the shift. This is why verse 16 is the switch. It's the connection of verse 4. It brings everything together in the prophet Habakkuk's conversation with God. Notice chapter 1, verse 2. Look at it. Verse 2 of chapter 1, here is Habakkuk's initial question to God. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Does it seem like Habakkuk is on his knees trembling when he asks that question? I would say no. It seems like Habakkuk is standing and pointing his finger at God and saying, God, how long do I have to wait? That's what it sounds like to me. Now notice the shift. Verse 16, chapter 3, we just read it. My body's trembling. My lips are quivering. I see how unworthy I am. My legs are trembling beneath me. Second part of the verse. I have encountered you, O holy God, and I will quietly wait for the day of trouble. This is a massive shift in Habakkuk's posture towards God. Verse 2 of chapter 1, how long shall I cry for help? Verse 16 of chapter 3, I will quietly wait. Who am I? Notice chapter 1, verse 2, Habakkuk is saying, God, this is how I feel. Verse 16, after this conversation in chapter 3 with God, then you hear, this is what I know. The word reveals the knowledge of God, who's at work for the salvation of his people. And then through the power of the Spirit, we move forward. This is how I will live. When you read the rest of 16, this is, okay, God, I've asked you these questions and you've answered me. And so this is what I'm going to do. Even when life seems like it is at the very worst it has ever been, I will quietly wait. Notice, it doesn't say, I will quietly wait for my circumstances to change. It doesn't say that. It says, I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. I will quietly wait for all the circumstances of what it looks like for you to judge Judah. And I will quietly wait that I know, God, that you are good, that you are slow to anger, that you are abounding in steadfast love. And so wherever Babylon measures on the wickedness scale, I know that ultimately you will deal with Babylon the way that you need to deal with Babylon. I will trust in the ultimate outcome of history is the resolve that Habakkuk has. Verse 17, again, this is such beautiful imagery of ancient life. Notice verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Old Testament, you want to know and understand the Old Testament, you have to know and understand agrarian societies. It's essential. And so right here, we get the agrarian absolute dependence on life. These are the levels of intensity for ancient people's existence. And it starts soft and it gets super intense. It starts with the fig. Now, figs I can take, they're okay. I haven't developed my palate for figs, but I love blueberries. So if I was using this, I would say, though my blueberries failed, life will go on. I don't need blueberries. I like them a lot, but I don't need them. So ancient people living in the region they're like, man, figs are good. They're sweet. Man, you see the fig tree, it's beautiful. But if it doesn't produce figs, life kind of stinks. But I'll live with it. Then it intensifies. But grape, nor fruit beyond the vines. The grape was more important than the fig. It produced wine. It produced lots of different things for the people. It was a staple in the pantry. But if the grape fails, we do have water. They're out of bubbly at Costco. I can't get my LaCroix, but I can actually open the faucet and I have water. See, the intensity moves. Then it moves from the grape to what? To the olive. Now, the olive oil, we're starting to shift. Olive oil is absolutely moving towards essentialness. It's used for cooking. It's used for fuel. It provides light. It creates the opportunity for lamps to be lit. There's something essential. It's not just, I love blueberries. It's, olive oil is part of everyday living. And then we move from olive oil to the field. Now we're getting serious. And the fields yield no food. Well, the primary source in the field was grain, and the primary grain was barley and wheat. It was the primary food source, bread. If you didn't have anything else, you had bread made from the wheat that you ground. Now, if that crop fails, hunger starts to set in. Life begins to get a little more desperate. But even beyond the field, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Now we're talking about our very way of living. If the flocks are cut off, the sheep and the goats, then we no longer have the necessities that we need. You see, most of people in ancient cultures, meat was a treat. So it's not talking about, you won't get to have your meat at night. It's talking about you won't get to have your livelihood, the cattle. All is representing the resources that you have. How many sheep and goats and cattle that you owned, cattle that you owned. It showed your wealth. It showed your resources. It showed your livelihood, and you were able to work the land because you had those things. And if those are cut off, if all of this was lost, the fig, the grape, the olive oil, the field, the flock, it would mean complete economic disaster. That's what's being described at the end of Habakkuk. And notice where Habakkuk is. I will wait quietly for the day of the Lord, the second part of 16, for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom. Again, he's talking about the circumstances of Judah. He's talking about what is going to be the reality of his life. Nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the yield, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Verse 18, even when there is complete economic disaster, but, ... verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. When life is at its absolute worst, Habakkuk says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy, not in my circumstances. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. He is the one that brings stability into my life. He is the one that helps me navigate the rocky terrain of life like a deer. Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. Paul says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, the fig, the grape, the olive oil, the field, the flock, and count them as rubbish. Complete economic disaster. I won't think about that, in order that I might gain Christ. Man, repetition is good for the soul, but repetition also makes you tune out. And please do not tune out. Jesus is better. He's greater. He's worth it. He's enough. He's compelling. That's what Paul says in Philippians. That's what Habakkuk says. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. Make the connection, the action of waiting. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. The end of all things is at hand. The action of waiting. Therefore, here it is. Be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks is one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves is one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11 is as precise as it can be when it comes to the action of waiting. In your waiting, you want to know what to do? Here it is. So the final questions for this morning. How are you self-controlled? How are you sober-minded? Is prayer a disciplined necessity? Are you loving others, the church, well? Do you live in the comfort of grace? Are you hospitable? Do you welcome others into your life? Do you know your spiritual gift and or gifts? Are you using it or them? Is Jesus being glorified in everything you do? Is this what is occupying your time while you wait? You see, that's what it means to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus. It's a lot of waiting. But as we wait, God has given us a whole heck of a lot to do. And 1 Peter 4 gives us the specific list. The end of all things is at hand. And so as you wait, here's what your life should be about. God, thank you for this morning. Thank you for Habakkuk. Thank you for the clarity But the answer that you give to Habakkuk is you are at work for the salvation of your people, and that you are a God of whom we can trust no matter the absolute dire circumstances that we might find ourselves in. God, may our worship be pleasing to you. May our lives get adjusted. May we be open to all the changes that need to take place in the depths of our souls so that you and you alone in my life, in our life, are better, are greater, are worth it, are enough. That you and you alone would be compelling. That we would seek you above all things. And that we would be really, really good in the waiting. Because it's the faithfulness of your people that grows the righteousness of your people. And all of it requires courage that comes from your Spirit. Because Jesus, you have said, and I am with you always till the end of the age.